What will happen if Russia declares war on Ukraine? It seems a silly question, doesn't it? The invasion has been going for over 2 months now, but technically Russia has not declared war. It's not a trick they are alone in, of course. The United States, for example, was never at war with Afghanistan, despite what, a 20-year-long occupation? Nor did the US declare war against Iraq either. Instead, Congress passed what they called the Public Law 107243, titled Authorization for the Use of Military Force in Iraq, Resolution of 2002. Because, well, just like Russian special military operations, the US too can apply the usage of military force without going to war. So yeah, it's hardly rare in this day and age for nations to invade one another, whilst wholeheartedly insisting that they have done no such thing. And since I do try to be as neutral as I possibly can on this channel, an endeavor I feel ever more alone in, it is relevant to mention that what Russia is doing is not at all that out of the ordinary. But to return to the topic at hand, it has been rumored for a few weeks now that maybe Vladimir Putin will announce an official declaration of war against Ukraine during the Victory Day celebrations on May the 9th. Today, incidentally, if you're watching this on the release day. And so what effect, if any, such a thing will have is an exceedingly relevant topic. Personally, I give it about a 50-50 chance. On the one hand, declaring war on Vday will give Putin a roaring and ready audience. Add in a sufficiently fiery speech at the end of a lengthy and impressive military parade, and there is every chance Putin could rally the nation firmly behind himself, no matter the cost. On the other hand, admitting on the biggest holiday in all of Russia that the invasion is not going well and that general mobilization of old men and women will be needed is going to put quite the damper on the festivities. Regardless, however, of whether it is done on the 9th or later, the actions taken by the Russian state will remain much the same. Firstly, to legally be allowed to mobilize, the state must fulfill certain obligations required by Russian law. Firstly, to be allowed to mobilize, the state must be in a state of war. Secondly, since the launching of an aggressive war is illegal in accordance with international and Russian law, mobilization can only occur when Russia itself is under attack, since that is the only circumstance in which Russia can actually be at war. Furthermore, conscripted soldiers are, unless the nation itself is again in a state of war, forbidden from being deployed to any other nation for any reason. Only contract soldiers may be deployed outside of Russia's borders in peacetime. The astute observer amongst you will notice a fair few of these laws have already become the victims of creative interpretation. Russia has not invaded Ukraine, it has not launched a war on a foreign power, and therefore is not guilty of launching an illegal invasion. It has merely launched special military operations. And there is plentiful suggestion as well that conscript soldiers are deployed to Ukraine, leaving only the Russia itself must be attacked clause in the way of a general mobilization, and, well, I am sure with a little goodwill, an artillery strike could easily be defined as an attack on Russia. So in reality, there are no real legal barriers to a Russian declaration of war and mobilization. Now, precisely what will happen then is a bit more open to interpretation. What is almost certain to happen is an expansion of the strategic war in Ukraine. And with that, I mean the deployment of mass strategic weaponry like bomber-launched cruise missiles, something Russia has so far been relatively reticent to deploy en masse. We are also likely to see a stepping up in Russia's attempts to strike Western arms convoys as they cross into Ukraine. They're not going to be so crazy as to actually attack the West, mind you, because Putin is not crazy. He's absolutely aware that he can't fight NATO, at the very least not conventionally. We will return to the idea of an escalation in the strategic war later on, but let's get to the question on everyone's mind. Militarily, in terms of numbers and capacity, how would the Russian army change if a mobilization was to go ahead? Well, first and foremost, we must have a look at the Russian system. In Russia, there is a three-tiered system of military service. Conscript soldiers are those who have been conscripted for their mandated period of military service, a year. And then contract soldiers, those who have volunteered for service and signed a contract for X amount of years, from 1 up to 3. And finally, there are reservists. These are men aged between 27 and 60 who have completed their conscript or contract term and are now considered reserve military personnel. There are about 2 million of this third class of soldiers. In addition to this, women with relevant military knowledge or experience can also be drafted alongside the men. For example, female doctors or nurses, or those relatively few have volunteered for service in the army previously. A mobilization would be primarily aimed at this final group, the reservists and those with relevant military knowledge. But there is also another element, which is the regular army draft that happens twice a year. One round already happened late last year to get Russia ready, and it is currently in the midst of a draft right now. In theory, this draft can affect anyone ages 18 to 27, and there are some 1.2 million men currently in that age bracket, though normally only about half or so are asked to show up for evaluations, and only a half or a third of those again are actually enlisted into the Russian army. Altogether then, assuming that all the reservists are called up and a full military draft, Russia could mobilize 3+ million men, one of which would be raw recruits that would need to go through at least the accelerated training program, which is 1 month of basic training followed by 3 months of advanced training, contra the usual 2 months basic and 6 months advanced. The other 2 million men are considered, as mentioned, to be reserve military personnel, though, mind you, that is by the Russian definition, as in they have at some point previously been in the army. This differs quite drastically from the Western definition of active reserves, which means that they have monthly or at the very least annual refresher exercises. Only about 5 to maybe 10% of Russian reservists are expected to be up to this standard. Russia has been trying to increase this percentage over the last few years, but the Russian army has simply not had the budget to conduct frequent and large-scale military exercises to keep their reserves up to snuff. It should also be mentioned that the 3 million plus estimate does not take into account lawful exceptions, due to health reasons or a criminal record which bars you from military service in the Russian army, or any other host of reasons. Now, the mobilization law also does state that the Russian army will be able to call up anyone who has been called up previously and been denied or turned down, including potentially those with valid excuses. So, even if a Russian citizen was allowed to not join the army previously due to a disability, this reason might not be considered valid in the case of a general mobilization. Nevertheless, a lot of people are simply not going to be particularly valuable soldiers due to disabilities like, blindness, for example. So the real number of soldiers will probably be a lot lower than the 3 million estimate. But, assuming Russia goes through with the mobilization, what would be the effects, immediate and long-term, and how would it be organized? And how might it best be done? Well, a full mobilization of all available personnel would be devastating to the Russian economy, already groaning under Western sanctions. You can't simply just pull some 3 million men out of the economy wholesale and not expect some pretty terrible consequences. Even more so when they will also need to be fed, housed, clothed, armed, and transported, all at the state's expense. And that really is just the start of the bureaucratic headache it is to conjure forth an army from the ether. So let's have a quick look at the process, shall we? First and foremost, when the mobilization is announced, the affected age groups and brackets will be declared. Those selected will be expected to show up to their local military commissariat. Yes, that is the actual name. And failing to show up is a criminal offense. The army may also start tracking down and actively fetching people who are supposed to be reporting for duty straight off the streets. Once enrolled, the reservists, whom, as you remember from earlier, are still considered to be trained military personnel, will likely be dispatched directly to the front to replace combat casualties in already active units. Those reservists who remain will then either be used to bring reserve formations up to full strength before being deployed, or they will form the center core of formations that currently only exist on paper, who will then be fully formed with fresh conscripts. A quick note on the reserve formation thing too. The Russian army is made up of a weird mix of brigades and divisions. Back in the day, the division was the primary unit, a large military formation that was only partially staffed with a small skeleton crew, intended to be brought up to full strength when needed by reservists and conscripts. This was a very cumbersome system that produced a lot of lazy officers in high positions and cushy officers with very little to do, and who tended to do very little else. A political push was made to move from the division to the brigade instead, with the brigade being a much smaller formation that would be almost fully staffed at all times with professional soldiers, ideally at least 60, maybe as high as 80% manned. Now, of course, the brigade is much smaller than the division, and so this would mean fewer theoretical troops in the long term, but would also mean way more effective combat troops available and organized from day one. The initiative only partially succeeded, however, and was never fully implemented, due to resistance from aforementioned division-level officers in their comfy officers, and due to Russia having tried and by and large failed to increase the number of professional soldiers available at any given time. The situation as it stands right now in the war, however, most of those near fully staffed brigades, the good ones, the organized and combat-ready ones, will already have been deployed. There are undoubtedly going to be some lying around here and there in other areas of Russia, but the majority that can immediately be relied upon will already be at the front. But there are many regiments attached to divisions that only exist on paper, or in the form of a skeleton staff. Indeed, many of the divisions already deployed to Ukraine have been deployed with only about half or so of their complete complement of regiments, meaning that theoretically, these could be brought up to full combat-ready status relatively quickly, presuming the manpower and the equipment can be found. Therefore, these regiments and brigades would be the first ones formed once the immediate combat casualties have been replaced, with any reservists left over being used to create new brigades or divisions from the ground up or reactivated from the old Soviet-style system, where there are lots of divisions in the old books that currently do not exist, beyond a handful of banners and insignias somewhere. In theory, then, this system would create a very rapid rush of new combat-ready and relatively organized divisions and brigades. At least the organizational structure would already exist, you would just have to fill it up with men. These would then be ready to move to the front and fight at a very short period of equipping and assigning of soldiers. And if this mass mobilization could guarantee a swift victory, it might very well be worth the economic cost. But theory and practice tends to be somewhat different in this regard. And since Ukraine has already completed its mobilization, even if Russia was to throw every man it had at them, victory would probably not be guaranteed, and even less so, a swift one. as these new troops would, despite their technical definition as trained military personnel, be far worse off in terms of training, equipment, and, crucially, motivation than those who already tried for the quick win 2 months plus previously. And of course, even if Russia declared mobilization, it's not like 3 million soldiers just walked to the front line overnight. It would probably take a month at least, maybe more, for the system to gather, transport, assign, organize, equip, etc., 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 the millions of men. Meaning Ukraine would have plentiful warning to dig in and prepare for the storm. A full-scale mobilization, therefore, seems unlikely. It would cost a titanic amount and be far from certain to settle things quickly. But I do believe that if Putin retains any ambitions of a victory in this war, he will need to carry out some sort of limited mobilization at the least. Because the Russian army does need more men. It is currently the attacking side, whilst being outnumbered by the defender. A very bad idea. To make matters worse, the Battalion Tactical Group, which I covered in its own video previously, is currently the most effective formation of the Russian army. And whilst it is certainly very impressive on paper, and it has shown itself to be able to punch well above its weight as well, it is extremely vulnerable to attrition. Due to the very low percentage of IFV mounted infantry, even the loss of just a few squads can render a battalion-sized formation de facto combat ineffective, at least insofar as seizing territory is concerned. And judging by the process of recent Russian offensives, where we see relatively quick gains on day 1 that begin stagnating on day 2 and grinding to a complete halt on day 3 onwards, that BTG weakness seems to be in full effect, necessitating immediate and continuous access to replacement personnel. And the BTGs at the front now will almost certainly already have cannibalized previous BTGs redeployed from the failed northern offensive that withdrew back into the Russian borders. So the Russian army is almost certainly, as it stands right now, running very, very low on trained infantry manpower. So, assuming Russia does need a mobilization, but it wouldn't want to afford a full one, more realistically then, what I would imagine to be best would be a partial mobilization, focusing first and foremost on getting 200,000 to 600,000 reservists, placing preferences on those who have maintained a decent degree of readiness by participating in military exercises. These, the best of the relative bunch, would then be sent to bring the units already at the front back up to full strength. Since the initial Russian invasion force was some 200,000 odd men, this should leave plenty of reservists for a, reserve as well, to keep the BTGs moving by consistently providing replacements for the inevitable casualties. This will allow the Russian army to both keep holding its current positions and potentially launch counterattacks, or, should an opportunity present itself, a little offensive here and there. The rest of the reservists will then be held back to help staff fresh formations that will be filled up with conscripts. And this is where the big, truly new numbers will come in. Whilst the reservists will primarily be used to maintain the status quo and stiffen up the line, the draft should be expanded to some 600,000 new conscripts. These would in turn be bolstered by some reserve personnel, organized into fresh brigades and given the full 8 months of training, as, frankly, tossing a bunch of green cannon fodder into the field after 4 months just ain't gonna do Russia much good, really. Instead, the quick victory should be delegated to a bookshelf alongside the other fairy tales, whilst the new army gets properly ready for another all-out offensive in March 2023. Now, obviously, there are some but wait whatabouts in this scenario, as even with a full mobilization of this size, the Russian army would still only have a rough parity to slight superiority in numbers with Ukraine. But as the attacker, they should at least have enough for fixing forces and to guarantee local superiority when attacking. A bigger problem might be how Ukraine could evolve in a year. Currently, Russia has superiority in terms of artillery and air power, with the potential to strike Ukraine with essential impunity. We will get to the strategic bombing in but a moment, rest assured, but God and the birds alone knows how much more military aid Zelensky's winning smile could bring Ukraine in a year. Already, modern Western artillery is starting to trickle in, and the US is pledging fresh printed billions in aid damn near every month. The real nightmare scenario would be a Ukraine protected by US Patriot missiles, whilst employing German Panzer howitzers, and with every infantryman carrying British/Swedish NLAWs, all paid for by a seemingly inexhaustible spring of US dollars. That's only going to happen, though, so long as Zelensky remains the kingmaker. Right now, every single solitary unpopular politician in Europe is lined up like so many working girls of the Moulin Rouge, to bask in his reflected glory. But, judging by Google Trends, the fickle eye of the West might soon be moving on to shinier things. It would hardly be the first time the wider world forgot about a war. There's still one going on in Syria right now, for example. That was hot shit for a bit there, with Obama's red line, which, when immediately crossed, caused the then president to draw a second line further back, but oh well, details. And speaking of details, it is time to finally address the other form of escalation besides mobilization. So far, Russia's strategic level war on Ukraine has been relatively hesitant. General estimates suggest maybe 1,000 cruise missiles launched, 1,500 tops over the course of the war, with only single planes dropping parts of their weapon loads in individual strikes on Ukrainian targets. And make no mistake, 3 to 6 cruise missiles hitting a city is nasty to be sure, but it is nothing compared to what Russia could be doing. A single Tupolev 22M can carry 10 cruise missiles, each with a 400 kilogram conventional warhead. And Russia has over 60 of these planes. Incidentally as well, a bit of a side note here, in one of the many absurdities of war, Ukraine actually used to have these planes and weapons too, as they are Soviet-era tech that they inherited from the Soviet Union. But Ukraine dismantled all of their Tu-22s as a part of a disarmament treaty with the United States, and either destroyed or gave the cruise missiles back to Russia. Something, weakness is a provocation. And if Putin decides to go the way of Goebbels and declare total war, the devastation that could be done to Ukraine would be awful indeed, not just to cities, but to its defense industry. Ukraine relies on half a dozen or so major land arms producers centered mostly in the major cities. Kharkiv, for example, contains practically all of Ukraine's tank and IFV upgrading and manufacturing works. Similarly, Ukraine's largest producer of firearms is located in Vinnytsia, well within range of Russian cruise missiles fired from Tupolevs operating in Belarusian airspace. Most of their aerospace, defense, manufacturing and repair, which is, to be fair, fairly pointless at this point, is located in Kiev as well. Russia has already been striking some of these targets, even using their new hypersonic Kinzhal missiles to do so. This also was a bit of a display of strength too, to simply be like, hey, we have these weapons and they do actually work, which was a genuine question considering the failures of many other pieces of Russian tech over the years. The precise effect of these limited strikes is so far unknown. In fact, the state of both sides' arsenal is very difficult to determine. I remember seeing articles back in March suggesting Russia was about to run out of cruise missiles. A month plus of continued, if small-scale usage, seems to have disproven that notion, though only Putin and his generals truly know how many they have left, or how fast they can be replaced. Simultaneously, Ukraine was expected to be able to produce nothing more than 16 to 20,000 artillery shells per year, and to only have enough small arms munitions for 2 months of heavy fighting. Western aid will of course have helped a lot, but just like with Russia, only a few know how good or bad their supplies are looking. Which brings us to the third and final topic, a war economy. This conflict has devoured weapons at a rate rarely before seen. For example, the US claims to have delivered some 7,000 javelins, out of an expected stock of 20 to 25,000. In other words, in 2+ months, the US has, in an indirect war, burned through a third or more of its advanced infantry-carried anti-tank systems. To put this in yet further perspective, the maximum current theoretical production rate of javelins is about 6,800 per year, and right now, only about 1,000 per year are produced. In a similar vein, Ukraine has requested to be able to purchase 100 self-propelled howitzers from Germany, specifically the Panzerhaubitze 2000. The entire German army has 120 of these. This, by the way, is once more why World War III will be a trench war, fought with sticks, stones, and bolt-action rifles, but I digress. Russia's situation is unknown, but it must probably be getting a bit dire too. And one thing I neglected to mention in the mobilization part is, can Russia even equip another 1.2 million total troops? Small arms are unlikely to be a problem. Over 5 million AK-74s have been produced, and the Russian munitions production is enormous, exporting billions of rounds every single year. Tanks, APCs, and IFVs are also unlikely to be an immediate issue, since there are thousands still in storage, though many will require substantial overhauls and upgrade packages to be fitted before being truly up to standards. Likewise, artillery and shells should also be fine. The problem might come in the production of precision munition. Before the war, estimates vary, but Russia was expected to have maybe 5,000 to 10,000 cruise missiles of various types. This is on the higher end of the estimate, as I have also seen numbers as low as 2,000 to 3,000, but, well, if those were true, Russia should already be running dry now. Still, with a sizable influx of soldiers and the need to continue a strategic bombing campaign, along with maintaining artillery superiority with constant bombardment and battery duels, the base-level Russian military production will undoubtedly be strained. Perhaps too strained. In such a case, mobilization might be less about the men it brings and more about the state power that comes along with it. Whilst on a war footing, the Kremlin will have sweeping powers to intervene in the economy, prioritizing and boosting the production it deems necessary, or even establishing entire new factories or production lines. It would also allow Putin to cut through a lot of red tape and order the focusing on replacement Russian variants of Western tech currently used and mostly banned in, for example, tanks or missiles. This might sound complicated, like how can Russia quickly replicate a fancy pants piece of tech in, say, a cruise missile? But if they already have the technology, they already have the fancy Western doodad, then reverse engineering it is not all that difficult. They might not be able to create a variant as good, but they can certainly whip up a serviceable replacement relatively easily, as we have seen with the Turkish TB2 drone, where Turkey was caught illegally using, for example, cameras produced in Canada, which were technically placed under an export ban for weapons use, but The Turks, of course, simply lied and then mounted them on the drones anyway. Once exposed, it took them a couple of months at worst to make their own, again, worse, but serviceable variant. And I am sure this is something Russia could do as well. And I'm equally sure it is something Russia is going to have to do soon if it wants to maintain the intensity of the conflict. In conclusion, then, is a mobilization likely? I think a mobilization is practically inevitable if Putin wants to win the war. Now, he may simply declare a referendum in Kherson, introduce the ruble, and then have it withdraw from Ukraine in a totally free and fair election, and then declare victory and walk away. Entirely possible, especially as the war in Ukraine has almost for sure cost Putin a lot more than he had ever envisioned it costing. And in many ways, you could absolutely see a general mobilization as nothing more than reinforcing failure. The war in Ukraine might very well already have been de facto lost for Russia, and paying billions of rubles more to mobilize a bunch of men, causing all kinds of discontent on the home front alongside all of this, only to see them fail as well, is not going to be a net benefit for Russia. On the other hand, it has also been a massive humiliation for Putin and for Russia. It has turned Russia into a laughingstock internationally, and the great, strong, powerful leader of the Soviet Union 2.0 might not be willing to let that stand. As for the effect militarily that a mobilization would have, I do absolutely believe that a general ramping up of the strategic war will cause a lot of damage to Ukraine's ability to wage war. And if Western arms convoys moving via trains or sea or truck could be intercepted and destroyed, it would be a major Russian success if they could continuously do this, especially also as I firmly do believe the eyes of the West are already beginning to move away from Ukraine. A more passive approach is almost certainly the correct one for a long-term victory, assuming Putin has the patience to wait that long. And if Russia can reinforce the front line and then bring up another 600,000 fresh troops next year, it may very well be enough to, at the very least, force Ukraine to negotiate on Russian terms, if not be enough to win the war outright. Then again, Ukraine has impressed mightily so with its ability to resist. At this point, I really can't discount the possibility that they might just pull another miracle from their grain silos. Only time will tell, and hey, if nothing else, by the time you're watching this, you will probably already have received the answer of whether or not Putin will declare a mobilization on the 9th of May. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.